Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Milos Majore, and together with my colleague Andrew Loftusness, we'll be talking about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. We'll be starting off with a brief roundup of all of our major developments happening in each of our regular hotspots, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then we'll turn to our colleague Shahad Turkistani, our in-house resident expert on energy, climate, and the Middle East, to explore in further detail some of the developments related to the recently signed U.S Saudi nuclear deal. As always, you can find more in-depth analysis and forecast of all of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor, which we publish every Friday alongside this podcast. So with that in mind, before getting to our discussion, let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, what have you got for us from the Middle East this week?
So the Middle East trended toward the military escalation scenario for a number of different reasons. So let's look at some of the most important ones. Saudi Arabia directly joined the war against Iran when it conducted bombing runs with the United States in Iraq against Iranian-backed militias known as the Popular Mobilization Forces. At least 20 were killed in that attack, and that was triggered by PMF drone attacks against energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Iran fired missile attacks at U.S. forces in Jordan. The Jordanian Defense Forces intercepted those missiles, and there were no casualties as a result of those attacks. However, the U.S. retaliated by conducting dozens of bombings, primarily against IRGC positions across the country. That has been going on for the last 48 hours into today. The IRGC also claimed attacks against at least 3 vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. And the geographic reach of the conflict extended yet again when a U.S.-owned energy site was struck by a drone in Egypt. That attack has not been publicly attributed to any perpetrator. Looking now at the Levant, Israel conducted a series of artillery bombardments across southern Lebanon in retaliation from an attack against Hezbollah. Now that attack from Hezbollah was an FPV drone strike against an unmanned Israeli bulldozer. No casualties resulted from that attack. However, this does threaten to shatter the most recent fragile ceasefire mediated by the United States. And then finally, Trump hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House July 29th. We'll deep dive into more Middle East topics in our conversation with Shahad. So let's take a look now at the situation in Europe. Transatlantic relations in the Russian-Ukraine war trended towards the status quo. The U.S. Senate recently voted to procedurally advance a new package of sanctions against Russia. Trump hosted Zelenskyy at the White House July 29th. That was the same day that he hosted Netanyahu, so quite a busy week on Pennsylvania Avenue. Zelenskyy said that the meeting went very well, and in addition to hopeful renewed diplomatic efforts from the United States, he said that he offered the U.S. support in the realm of drone defense in the Middle East, requested an emergency air defense package from the United States for Ukrainian cities in anticipation of Russian bombardment this winter. Now, Ukraine conducted a significant drone attack against Moscow that utilized at least 390 individual drones. And Ukraine also very notably attacked an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. That attack killed at least 1. Ukrainian officials claim that that ship was transporting Russian military supplies. Finally, and notably, the American conservative influencer and informal Trump advisor Laura Loomer reversed her position on Ukraine and urged Trump to provide support to Ukraine and to reinvigorate the diplomatic process following a visit to that country where she met with a number of senior Ukrainian officials, including Zelenskyy. Now, that might seem like an unusual update. But for those who don't follow these things too closely, keep in mind that Loomer is in the category of influencers who are very influential with the president. For example, earlier this year, at her advice, the president fired a number of staffers on the National Security Council. So this is, in fact, a very influential person in U.S. policy and national security.
Thanks, Andrew. And now turning to the Indo-Pacific. So the region trended towards military escalation as we saw that for the first time, the American Institute in Taiwan, which is the US's de facto embassy on the island, publicly shared a photo of a joint patrol that was conducted by the Taiwanese and American Coast Guards. Now, this is not the first time that there have been joint patrols and joint drills between both countries. However, it is the first time that we've seen the AIT publicly share this kind of a photo, which we have not yet received any public statement from China to its regards. However, it does imply a strong signal that the US is willing to make concerning its defense of the island. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense also reported that China has expanded its construction of replicas of Taiwanese government buildings at its military training grounds. These replicas of government buildings are used for the training of personnel as well as in joint drills involving multiple services of the Chinese military. And this is not the first time that Taiwan has reported on these either. We've had the news within the past year that not only are Taiwanese government offices replicated, but we've also seen satellite imagery with apparent replicas of Japanese government buildings as well. Beijing, on its end, has urged that the United States remove its newly imposed 12.5 forced labor tariffs, as China's Politburo announced it is aiming to expand trade with all of its global partners. This comes as the US has just expanded its tariffs under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act. Previous tariffs of 10% under Section 122 expired last week, so this is in quick succession. These tariffs have been imposed one after the other. The statement coming from China that it wants to expand its trade relations concerns all of its global partners, not only the United States, but also the EU, although the EU has also been advancing its packages of anti-dumping measures against Chinese imports. China further warned that it would be imposing retaliatory measures against any US sanctions placed against Chinese AI and robotics companies, decisions that are reportedly under consideration in Washington. And then finally, Taiwanese authorities have apprehended an NVIDIA employee that they accuse of the smuggling of advanced microchips into China. So that rounds up the Indo-Pacific. Keeping an eye on some of the other hotspots that we track throughout the week. So in the United States, we got a statement from President Trump in which he said that concerning Venezuela, the United States had collected more than $13 billion from the sale of Venezuelan crude oil since U.S. forces captured former President Nicolas Maduro and assumed control of the country's oil exports in January. Trump made the remarks in response to a report estimating the revenue generated from the sales, and it should be said that the money is being held by the U.S., but it is being used for Venezuelan government expenses. And then finally, from Peru, we got some electoral news where Peru swore in its first elected female head of state as Keiko Fujimori narrowly defeated the leftist congressman Roberto Sanchez and became the country's president. Her victory marks an extension of right-wing governance of the country, with her campaign platform vowing stronger ties with the United States, as well as a tough-on-crime stance domestically. So on now to the discussion part of our podcast, and we're welcoming back to the show Shahad Turkistani, our in-house expert on all things energy in the Middle East. And this comes at a very topical time given the recently announced deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And this is something that we talked about in last week's episode, but we wanted to use this opportunity to delve into it a little deeper. So first of all, welcome back, Shahad. I know that you were on the show quite some time ago, but it's always good to have you back.
Thank you, Milosh. Of course, it's my pleasure to be here.
So we want to start off and just get your sense for a bit of a general background of the deal. So can you give us a reminder of what the deal actually involves, when it was announced, and what we can expect from it in substance?
So yes, of course, the deal is actually a really big step forward for both countries, Saudi Arabia and the United States. It basically advances the already existing strong relationship between the two countries. It's a 30-year civil nuclear cooperation agreement that establishes a legal framework for American firms like Westinghouse to help build Saudi Arabia's atomic infrastructure, basically. I think a key aspect of the agreement we're, of course, seeing discussed all over the news is that it doesn't require Saudi Arabia at this point to adopt the IAEA's additional protocol right away, which allows it to enrich uranium domestically. So this is basically instead of ruling out domestic enrichment, it establishes a framework between the two countries for joint studies to assess how uranium enrichment could be handled in the future. So I think this is a big step. In my humble opinion, it's a win for both countries. So yeah, that's basically the technicalities behind the deal.
Shahad, thank you for that background. Can you explain exactly what both Saudi Arabia and the United States get out of this deal? Why it is, as you said, a win for both countries?
Yes. Yeah, let me start with Saudi Arabia, actually, because I think Saudi here is the biggest winner, I think. Saudi has historically been wanting to have nuclear energy. As we know, Saudi Arabia has for the longest time has been a single commodity economy, basically using oil for export, for internal use, and for electricity and so on. So Saudi has, of course, as we may be all familiar with Vision 2030, basically wanting to diversify the energy, right? And as we all know, nuclear energy provides a baseload around-the-clock source, which is perfect for Saudi Arabia. It opens up opportunities to build advanced reactors and move forward to a more sustainable energy mix, which is, I think, a key pillar of Vision 2030. Right now, Saudi Arabia relies on natural gas for around 60% of its electricity generation, with oil making up the rest, basically. And 0% is coming from nuclear power. So you could imagine how huge this deal is if it actually ended up happening. It's going to change the whole energy mix in Saudi Arabia. It's going to bring nuclear into the mix. And in my opinion, it's not just timely, it's actually practically essential. As we know, nuclear acts as a very reliable and zero carbon baseload. So even for Saudi Arabia's zero carbon targets, it's going to help them to move to that goal fairly quickly. But there's a caveat here. I mean, with nuclear power plants, it might actually require a heavy upfront investment. But eventually, it pays off in the long run, and it will be more efficient and more stable energy foundation for the country. And then for the United States, I think it mainly secures major partnership and supports American industry. We're talking about workers, supply chain, major companies like Westinghouse or even Betco in that regard are set to supply the reactor technology and the construction of it, which a company like Bechtel already has a very massive and decade-long existing footprint in Saudi Arabia. So I anticipate it to play a big role. Westinghouse is already mentioned in the agreement for sure, but I'm sure more American companies will join and find the Saudi market as a very thirsty market in terms of nuclear energy technology. So yeah, that's, in my opinion, what's going to be beneficial for both countries.
Shahad, you mentioned Vision 2030 a couple of times. Could you explain for listeners who might not be familiar exactly what that is?
Yes, Vision 2030 is basically a roadmap for the country. It's a development plan that was established back in 2015. Once the new king was appointed, it basically discusses the country's energy diversification plan. Like I was saying, Saudi has always been relying on oil. Vision 2030 is basically saying, okay, the country is actually ready for an economic transformation. By 2030, we would like our energy mix to be 50% sourced from renewable. It's a very highly ambitious plan. It also includes things beyond energy, obviously, in terms of the social fabric of the country, in terms of, let's say, women participation in the workforce. For example, the country was aiming for a 25% participation rate for women. Of course, we're not yet in 2030, and that number is already 30%. So, these goals are meant to be adjusted, are meant to be, it's not like a fixed in stone kind of blueprint. It's actually meant to be a working vision, basically. And of course, energy and nuclear is a big part of it. And hopefully it's taking the country in the right direction.
Shahad, bringing it back to the deal itself, there was a few things you mentioned up top which I thought were interesting. So the first was the question of the timing of this deal, saying that it's quite a timely deal. And then the second was that you raised the question of this not being a done certainty at the moment. You know, there is still the chance that this doesn't go through for a variety of reasons. So I was wondering if you could explore those two ideas. So first of all, why is it that it is happening now, this deal, insofar as we know that the US is bogged down in Iran, to put it lightly, with all the complexities there? And second of all, what are some of the potential spoilers, as it were, or aspects that could derail this plan from actually going through?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the timing is, to me at least, is a bit natural here. The conversation did not start just now. They started, a few years ago, let's say with the Trump administration at least. It's always been contingent, at least from the Trump administration, on, let's say, normalization with Israel or, the joining of Saudi Arabia into the Abrahamic Accord. So Saudi, at that time didn't feel ready to commit to such conditions, and I think the same thing still carries until today. In terms of the timing, I think it's just a natural flow of, several meetings that's been going on between the two countries, and it seemed to be signed right now, maybe after things has been kind of de-escalated for a bit in terms of the war with Iran and so on. Of course, now we're seeing more escalations. And then in terms of spoilers, the deal has already been signed. That's already, Chris Wright has visited Saudi. They already sealed the deal. It's been announced by both countries, at least by both the Ministry of Energy in Saudi Arabia and with the Department of Energy in the United States. So we know that for sure. But of course, we've seen some interviews from Trump coming up and saying that, this is still contingent on Saudi Arabia joining the Abrahamic Accord. So to me, this is really the only obstacle, if I can call it that could really be laying in between, let's say, with this moving forward. But then Trump also came, a few days ago, saying that the Abrahamic Accord condition wasn't actually part of the deal when it was signed. So we have a lot of back and forth here on this regard, whether it's like who's gonna win at the end, if I can just put it this way. We'll have to wait and see. But I think this deal will move forward, and I think it will not include the Saudi Arabia joining the Abrahamic Accord. Saudi is not going to win much by joining the Abrahamic Accord. If anything, I think it's going to be not in their interests at this point. Saudi, of course, carries Islamic legitimacy and Arab legitimacy that needs to pay more attention to, or let's say, have many things into consideration, not just take things single-handedly like that. So that's really the only thing I'd say could potentially, let's say, harm the deal, but hopefully not. Yeah.
Shahad, really appreciate all of that insight. To keep things on Saudi Arabia but switch focus, there's been a number of important military and security updates lately, due of course to the war in Iran. Most recently, Saudi Arabia actually directly participated in strikes with U.S. forces against Iranian-backed PMF units in Iraq. What I think will have the longest term impact, though, is this recent escalation from the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis have declared a, quote, siege against Saudi Arabia, and they have said that they are essentially shutting down the Red Sea to all international trade and traffic. Could you give us a sense of what that looks like from Saudi Arabia right now, and what the discussion is domestically, and how the Saudi government has already responded, and how you think they will respond in the future if the Houthis do in fact continue to escalate in the Red Sea?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yes, of course, we live in a very changing dynamic, especially in the security front here. I think Saudi Arabia is finding itself in a kind of a pickle, because they used to export all of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. That was blockaded by Iran, as we all know. The strait was closed. So Saudi Arabia proved to be resilient. Most of that oil now shifted to the Red Sea. And it's been going, fairly stable. It's, of course, There are some shortages, but it was okay. And now, of course, like you mentioned, the Houthis decided to impose they call it a naval blockade over Bab al-Mandab. So, of course, this means if it actually happened, it means basically not just Saudi Arabia, but most GCC countries won't be able to export its own commodities, not just energy, but other commodities as well outside, which is, of course, a big threat to the kingdom. So sometimes having a proximity to these choke points is an advantage, but sometimes it's also a curse or a disadvantage, right? And that's really what made Saudi Arabia react the way it did, by launching these attacks against the Houthis or even in Iraq. As you know, the Saudi oil tanker has been hit, a few days ago in the Red Sea, and we've seen, Brent crude jumping back to almost $100 per barrel since May. The price of oil, of course, is very fluctuating. Now it's been going down too. So, but it's a very serious, developments in the Red Sea front, and Saudi Arabia has been trying to mitigate this risk for many years now. And the good thing is that they've recently been cooperating with the United States in organizing their response against the Houthis and other militias. Myself, I'm quite suspicious or skeptical of the capabilities of the Houthis and how much they can actually impose a blockade. At the end of the day, we have at least 7 bases in Djibouti, right? That they are there mainly to protect the Bab al-Mandab and other sea lanes there. And of course, the U.S. is a major player here. Whether the U.S. would be interested in, of course, coming and help secure Bab al-Mandab is something that is very that could change the game, basically. And I think the U.S. has been showing a lot of proactiveness in that regard, which is good. So far, actually, the movement in Bab al-Mandab has not been disrupted completely. But of course, the price of, let's say, premium insurance, the travel time has, of course, been increasing now. And we know all these implications that happen, but the Bab al-Mandab Strait is not closed yet. And hopefully, we don't see that in the coming few days. If Saudi maybe and, together with the United States, kept this momentum in kind of, responding back to these attacks, hopefully this will kind of deter or act as a deterrence to any further attacks by the Houthis. But then they're very unpredictable. They've been hitting targets before, even starting in 2019, energy facilities, tankers and all sorts of things. So yeah, I think the biggest impact we would see is definitely on the energy market. And maybe one last point, China here. China is a very important player here. China, of course, export and import most of its commodities through Bab al-Mandab, even more than the Strait of Hormuz. So any disruption to the Bab al-Mandab would affect countries beyond the region. That's for sure.
Well, with this current crisis, it seems like there's significant news every couple of hours. So, Shahad, we appreciate you coming on the show today and helping us to make sense of it.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Andrew and Milos.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have you back if this situation develops to pick your brain some more. So, yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Shahad.
Of course, I'm always happy to come here and discuss these things. Hopefully, positive things moving forward.
All right, Take care, Shahad. See you next time. So with that, we'll have to wrap up for today. And as a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the discussion we just had, as well as all the topics mentioned up top, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you both. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.